Good morning and welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church in Kingsport, Tennessee. We're continuing our series on what we call Anglicanism 101. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the antiquity of Anglicanism. Now, I have to make a disclaimer at the very beginning. We need to focus on what the issue specifically is. Now what that means is, and I'll explain it in a minute, but what that means is this is not, please understand, this is not a history of Great Britain course. So we are not going to be talking about all of the specifics involved in the development of Great Britain over the centuries. We will be talking specifically about how the ancient British setup demonstrates the antiquity of Anglicanism and its independence from Roman Catholicism. That's the point of this. The point is to emphasize that Anglicanism, number one, predates the Roman organization that we know, and number two, that even when Rome made an appearance on the British Isles, Anglicanism still had an identity of her own that's not dependent upon Rome. So what we're going to do is today we're going to just broadly, we're going to do a broad overview of what we're talking about. Next week, we'll get into some of the specifics, such as who was recognized when certain emissaries arrived from Rome to Great Britain, demonstrating a pre-existence of the church within Great Britain that does not find dependence on Rome. Okay? So, if you will remember, I emailed each of you guys 3 different maps. And the reason that I sent you 3 different maps was to show you the development of the ancient form. I love that. Can you hold that up, Rosalind? I mean, I can hold mine up, but that's the final one. That's the third one. That's the first one. Notice the broad swath and how they're... I'll do this for the camera. I guess I should have thought about that. But notice how the broad categories are identified of various regions. Let me get my finger out of the way. Setting up what comes next. What you're looking at is essentially Great Britain in the middle of the 4th century. So we're moving from Roman incursion. They have one over there. We're moving from Roman incursion in the mid-1st century, mid-40s, 50s, to 369, I think is the date on that, or 359 or something like that. So this is what we're seeing. And it becomes important to recognize these divisions. I'll get to that in just a second. From this broad Roman breakdown, and Roman I'm using in the sense of Roman government at this point, we get to the second map where various regions are beginning to take shape more specifically. And if you will look at the map when you get a second, you will notice that some of the regions that we've identified here on the board have made their appearance in in this particular map. And what we're looking at here in this map is essentially everything from the first map, 4th century, to approximately the 6th century. So now we've gone from the 300s to the 500s, and notice how diverse this map is. And then finally, now I say this with a caveat, we finally arrive at this, where you have the 7 major kingdoms that have been identified in the 3rd map. Now, that does not mean that all of those other little regions that we saw suddenly disappeared. It simply means that all of those other regions that we saw have been subsumed under these major kingdoms. Now, when we talk about Great Britain in this form, the thing that we have to realize is that if you go to the 2nd map, the one where it has the majority of, I'll just call them nation states, broken down, each of those has their own identity. They share a common identity, and I don't know if anybody actually realizes this, but when we talk about Anglo-Saxons, we're talking about the Germanic tribes. So essentially, when you talk about the early settlement of Great Britain, you're talking about primarily the Germans coming over and inhabiting the island. Now, when you look at that 2nd map and you see how sliced up that 2nd map is, keep this in mind. Think about that map. Think about those regions as if you're talking about Greek city-states. You're looking at nation-states, if you will. Each of those is a different clan. They're a different German clan. So they share some basic ethnic and ideological traits, but they still exist independently. And we'll see that probably in more detail next week when we start talking about how they interacted with one another and how they really, really didn't like one another. But they'll share the basic German religion. It's paganism, focusing on the god Woden, which, of course, the Vikings borrowed, or depending upon who you see as having precedent, the Germans borrowed from the Vikings, and we have Odin for the Norse gods, right? So this is what you see when we start talking about what is in place when Christianity arrives in Great Britain and tries to make inroads. Now you have to keep 2 very distinct ideas in mind. On the one hand, we see the way the island is broken up. German, 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 blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, we know that Christianity arrived in the 1st century. So what does that mean? It means that Christianity had to function like a boll weevil and work its way into each of these areas. And when we start to think of it in those terms, that's when these 7 kingdoms become primary. Because by the development of Great Britain breaking down into these 7 kingdoms, it provided, and I say this in scare quotes, it provided a slightly more accessible means for Christianity to be communicated. Now, I put this up here as reference, and the reason I put this up here as a reference is because this shows 2 things. That in some way, Christianity and Anglicanism in Christianity had already been fairly well established. The question then arises, if it had been fairly well established, what's the issue? Well, the issue is, if you look at those maps, which region was represented by bishops from Anglicanism? Because obviously it wasn't the entire country at that time. Okay? Now, we know that bishops were in, we actually have the names, see if I can find them. Did I write them down? No, I didn't write. I wrote the names down for the three main bishoprics. But we actually have the names of the bishops that appeared at the Council of Arles. We have a letter that is cited by Athanasius, where the bishops of Great Britain were in agreement with the council's decision. We also know that, and this is Bulgaria, Sardikia, we have bishops in Sardikia. Now, we don't know their names, but we know that there were British bishops there, because when the historians documented this particular council, they included the regions that were represented, and the two regions that were made some headway, I don't want to say headway, but were noted, were Gaul, France, and Britain. So we know that we have British bishops there. And then we have every Calvinist's enemy, the Council of Arminium. And it has nothing to do with Arminius, but that's the name of the council in 359. So we know, by the 4th century, we know we have bishops. Now, why does that become important? It becomes important for this reason. Christian organizational structure or episcopacy doesn't spring out of the ground like a mushroom, especially when you're engaging pagan religions. You have to overcome their ideology. You have to teach. What does that mean? It means that it takes time. So, if we know that we have bishops in the Council of Arles, 314, we know that there was some form of episcopate prior to 314, right? Makes sense? Mm-hmm. We also know that Tertullian, writing in the 200s, 200 AD, so early 3rd century, mentions British bishops. So, we're talking about episcopacy being formed in Great Britain very early on. Okay, I see furrowed brows. Why am I looking at furrowed brows? What's not clear?
I was just thinking, it was in place by the time Peter was considered the first bishop of the church.
What, episcopacy?
At least the beginning of the structure.
Okay, that gets back to the discussion we had when we talked about the book. The idea of a threefold order was derived from the Jewish priestly system. High priest, priest, and Levite. Yes. So the main element, the main structure was there. Now, there had to be development because we don't have apostles. So something had to take the place of the apostle, and it did. We call them bishops. So when you look at, and this is something that is very difficult for a lot of Christians to accept, things just didn't fall out of God's fax machine into our laps with diagrams, charts, and bullet points. He gave us the basic structure in the Old Testament, or as he calls it, a pattern or a blueprint. That's the word that's used, both in Hebrew and in Greek. It's a blueprint. And this pattern was to be followed. When you start getting into the New Testament area in the first century church, what winds up happening is that pattern has to be accommodated. And it has to accommodate the inclusion of Gentiles. That occurs late in the first century, moving into the second century. So episcopacy, yes, was there. There's no question about it. But it wasn't there, again, in the sense that we understand what episcopacy is today. It wasn't neat, polished, and organized the way we see it today. It had to go through that developmental process. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just reality. Paul goes to the synagogues and spends his entire early part of his entire ministry after conversion teaching in the synagogues. And he tells us, I went to the synagogue. Luke tells us they went to the synagogues. Jesus taught in the synagogues. Why? Because he came to save the lost house of the sheep of Israel, right? The lost sheep of the house of Israel, excuse me. So we know that this is how it began. When Paul got thrown out, and basically in Ephesus was almost killed, he said, "Yeah, pox on your house. I'll go talk to the Gentiles. They'll listen to me." But what did he present to the Gentiles? He didn't make up his own religion. He was a rabbi. He taught what he taught the Jews. However, we see both from the Jerusalem Council and we see from his writings, specifically in Colossians and a little bit in Ephesians, we see Paul accommodating Gentile sensibilities. You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to slavishly be devoted because your salvation depends upon keeping all of the festivals of Israel, specifically the three main ones. So it's perfectly natural to see development as long as you understand what's being developed. We don't have the right to turn around and say, okay, yeah, it's all new. No, it's not all new. It's all founded upon something that God has already revealed. And the closer to which we maintain connection to that original revelation, the closer we will be to understanding what Christianity and what the church should look like. It's only when we start chopping away at our foundation, when we cut off our ideology from our roots, that we think we can walk in and de novo, from nothing, start anew. And that's what we see today. We see anybody pick up a Bible because of the Reformation. There are good things and bad things about the Reformation, but one of them is a complete misunderstanding of the priesthood of all believers and the ability for private interpretation. Private interpretation doesn't mean private authority. And this is the problem that evangelicalism has today. They think because you can pick up a Bible and read a Bible, that makes you an authority to speak for the church. That doesn't make you anything but an individual sharing an opinion. That's all that is. Only recognized authorities have the right to speak for the church. Look, you don't like it, fine, but that's the reality. And we see that problem today in a current issue that is literally dividing the church. Because somebody decided that they weren't going to listen to the authority above them. And what happens in these situations? Always. Now I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, but what happens in these situations? Eventually, somebody goes out and they start their own church. That's what happens. When you don't realize you're under authority, you take it upon yourself to be your own authority, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to go start my own thing. I'm going to start the church of happy clappy wearing clown noses. I mean, whatever it is. I've seen that. So when we get to this, we see that the seed has already been planted We know that Christianity was in Great Britain because archaeology alone tells us that in Roman barracks they found I showed you I think it was the last time, the Pater Noster cross, the Our Father. They also found the Cairo, carved into lintels. So the Roman soldier, and one of the other elements that we fail to realize is that when Claudius came over, it wasn't only soldiers that he took with him, right? He took administrators, he took counselors, he took chefs, he took all of the support crew that would accompany an army moving to a foreign objective. And even within those disciplines, you'd find Christians represented. So Christianity started with Rome with the Roman government moving into the country and laying the seed for the church to develop and grow as it was laid down for us in Scripture and then continued in the New Testament with the Apostle Paul.
I don't remember what year Claudius invaded.
Depending upon at what point of the invasion, it probably started somewhere around 45, 46, 47, somewhere in there. Now, let me show you how this breaks down so that you have an idea of what we're looking at. This large area here, you know what? I'm not going to write their names in.
Put the numbers.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. That's very smart. This is Northumbria. Okay? This is Mercia. Okay? This is East Anglia. This is Essex. This, yeah, I guess writing it sideways isn't helping you guys, is it?
We can handle it.
That is Kent.
Yeah.
This is Sussex.
But you had a 3.
And this is Wessex.
You got 2 3s.
Oh, sorry.
And this makes it 1.
No, there's 2. There's Essex.
There you go.
Essex is number 2. Now, if you'll notice, there's an area that's left blank, right? A couple of areas it's left blank. Here, 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 and here, right? Guess what they are?
Britain.
Who said it?
I read it.
Oh, you cheater.
Show off.
They're also Celts.
Yeah.
Give me a second. These are the Britons who essentially were Irish. That's how they were identified back at this time. And
They were called the Irish, or they use that word, or is that just how?
they were called Celts, but we know them as Irish. And I want to get this, there we go. All right. And in the 6th century, by the time we get to this final map, this was influenced by something that happened in 567. What happened in 567? Huh? What?
Rome fell.
No, Rome fell way before that. Come on, you Irish, you Irish people, come on. Come on. You got 2 minutes and then we're cutting it off.
Patrick.
What?
Patrick.
Close. Before him. Who's the next most significant Celt?
No, he's white. He's 1200.
Who did you say? Come on, stop whispering and just say it.
I was wondering about Wallace.
No, that's
That's what she said.
later. That's about 600 years later.
B.
Before, after B.
After B, before.
Left Ireland and landed in Scotland. Went to England and Scotland.
Iona.
Who? Saint.
Yeah.
They named a bay after him in Scotland. Come on, you asked the question last. Come on.
Iona.
Saint Columba
Column.
brought Christianity, at least that iteration, it's not AP, it's AD, at least that iteration of Christianity. And we will then pick up from there next week, and we'll start to flesh this out in relationship to specifics. But it's important to have this down and to see how important all of this is and how messy it is. It's not neat. And that messiness is what creates confusion when people start talking about this, because we don't like messy when it comes to historical or theological or even religious issues. We like things that are neat and clean and cut and dried. And if you like that, talk to Rosalind, become an engineer. Because that is not what happens in the church. Okay? All right. You got 15 minutes to ask any question you want except about British history.
Well, darn. Where does King Arthur fit into all this?
The Arthurian legend occurs as a connection with the myth of Joseph. I don't want to say that. I know I'll tick people off when I say it that. With the Grail legend and Joseph of Arimathea bringing Mary to Great Britain, that develops into the whole Grail lore, which then develops into the Arthurian legend, which is probably around, I'm just taking a guess, it's been so long since I've dealt with that, but you're looking probably around the late 10th century, the 900s going into the 1000 period. So, and that's where that starts to take off, the Knights of the Round Table and all of that romantic folklore. I'm trying to be polite.
Yeah, I heard that.
I think it's okay. Well, anyway, yes, I'm not going to comment anymore on that. I know I have a lot of friends that live and die on that. So,
Well, they found a sword in a stone.
Uh-oh.
it was planted there by Disney.
Why not?
Yeah, Michelle.
You talked about apostles not being in the picture anymore, but is that just the word? And in my mind, apostle means sent one. Do I have that right?
That's what the lexical meaning of the word is. Yes.
Don't we still have people being sent out by God?
Yes.
But you used a word that I don't know, episcope or something like that. What is that?
Episcopacy. It comes from the Greek word episkopos, which in every translation prior to the 18th century, 19th century, meant bishop. But its technical meaning is overseer.
That's all in your book.
Yes, it's in the book. But however, to answer your question, your specific question, anytime you deal with language, you have to understand connotation, denotation, right? What a word, okay. The definition of a word, the lexical definition, can be understood denotatively.
Okay.
This means this. However, when you apply that word, you can have different connotations of that word.
Okay.
All right? So, apostle, sent one, can apply to the action, can be an adjectival or an adverbial meaning, or it could be a noun, it could be a substantive referencing an office.
Okay.
All right? So what we identify as the office of apostle, and it's actually used in Acts chapter 1, the bishopric mentioned in Acts chapter 1 is mentioned as an office by, I believe it was Peter that said it. But with the death of John, that office ended. However, what the apostles did when they laid hands on Titus, Timothy, and others, they passed on apostolic authority to bishops. So the office doesn't exist anymore for this reason, and it's a simple reason. There are other reasons, but I'm going to just give you the primary reason. One of the primary qualifications of an apostle was that they had to physically see Jesus and spend time with Jesus. And there is no one after John, well, there's no one after 30 AD outside of the Apostle Paul that saw or spent time with Jesus while he was on earth. The ascension happened, and when the ascension occurred, that was it. That was it. So, I have a very jaundiced reaction when I hear people say, I saw Jesus yesterday. Really? Where'd you see him? Starbucks? Oh, he was in that Uber that you had, right? That's where you saw him. I'm sorry. Jesus specifically said, you will not participate with me in this meal. I will not partake of the bread or the wine, he said vine, but I will not partake of this again until when? I come again, the Son of Man comes again in glory. Now, unless somebody wants to assert that the second coming has occurred, and there are people that will make that argument, but I don't remember the sun turning black and the moon turning blood red, and I don't remember seeing the four horsemen of the apocalypse following Christ as he came down to judge the earth. I don't remember seeing any of that. Then the second coming hasn't come, and that means Jesus hasn't come back, and therefore nobody's seen Jesus today. No one. And I'm sure I'll lose some friends over saying that, but that's fine. That's fine. So, apostle as an office, apostle as a function. So everyone here in that sense, and I hesitate to say it, but everyone here in that sense is a type of apostle. We are a type of sent one. We are sent. Go, therefore, and make disciples. That's our responsibility. Go, and make disciples. So in that sense, yes, we're sent. We are apostles. But not everybody stands in the office of apostle, because that ended. What is transmitted is their authority, which gives them the right, rightly or wrongly, it gives them the right to adjudicate issues in which the church finds itself debating. Do you baptize infants, or do you only baptize adults? Godly people on both sides of the argument make their case, and we are at where? A stalemate. So who has the authority then to speak for the church? Not your church, not your denomination, but who has the authority then to speak for your church? And that's the question that you have to answer. Some will argue I can pick up a Bible and read the Bible for myself. That doesn't resolve the issue because we still have the debate. And we still have the difference of opinion. So at some point, somebody's got to say the buck stops here. Okay?
Thank you.
Make sense? Okay.
Modern day equivalent is missionary. Can missionary be?
Missionary is a type of apostle, but missionary has a very specific definition and function. A missionary, generally defined in missiology, is an individual sent to a particular location to perform a particular memory for a particular indigenous people. Much like the Koreans are sending Christians to the United States because we need to be evangelized. So in the sense in which Michelle identified it, what we're looking at are two very, very distinct understandings of the one word. One very narrow, one very broad. Very narrow one should be very easy to retain. Bunch of guys living prior to the end of the 1st century. 12 to be exact. Those were the apostles. Those they laid hands on became bishops. And we see how easily that carried forward in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, etc. The thing to keep in mind, and I mentioned it in the book, but I'll mention it again here. The thing to keep in mind is when you look at this discussion of church government, there is, let me say it this way. If episcopacy was in error, and all of this argument is in the book, so you can refer to it in the book. If episcopacy is a mistake, as people will argue, the more academic will say, well, episcopacy was there, but it was a different type of episcopacy. That's a debate we certainly can have. However, if episcopacy was in error, you have a problem, because the Apostle John lived late into the 1st century, at least until 95 AD, at least. And he had young disciples, young bishops, Polycarp, Ignatius, etc. And they taught episcopacy. Now, if episcopacy was wrong, number one, you mean to tell me that the disciples of the Apostle John would contradict his teaching while he was still alive? And keep in mind, the Apostle John was revered, not only in the church, even Rome revered him. So you've got that problem. And then the second problem is, if it were in error, why do you not see any other form of church government? Any form of church government within church history until the 16th century. So for 1,500 years, God didn't protect his church from the gates of hell. Is that what you want to argue? Even the assertion that it has no place comes into question, because when the heretics started to advocate their false teaching, one of the arguments that was presented against them, and you have to appreciate the you have to appreciate the literary flourish of Tertullian. He turned around and he basically said, "Oh, really? I'll tell you what. I'll sit here and I'll wait. You show us your list of bishops." And this is 200 AD. You show us your list of bishops. I'll wait. Go ahead. I can show you ours. You show us. You show me mine. I'll show you yours. You show me yours. I'll show you mine. Something like that. So anyway, now people will argue that's anecdotal. You still have to respond to it. You still have to address it. And you still have to come up with a legitimate argument that cuts off the early church. Hundreds, thousands of Orthodox Jews suddenly adopting a form of government totally different from what they understood their government to be. The reason one of the reasons that episcopacy became so seamlessly transitioned into Israel, because it's modeled on high priest, and Levite. The reason Jesus did not talk about a new form of government is he didn't have to. They understood. He worshipped in the temple. They worshipped in the temple. They worshipped his entire life in the temple. We've just seen during Advent and Epiphany, presentation in the temple, purification in the temple, everything revolving around the temple. Jesus shows up. Where does he go his first stop? The temple. So the onus is on our opponents. Okay, it's 10 o'clock. One more question. Yes, I knew there was one out there.
The area of the Far East,
Mm-hmm.
Britain,
Mm-hmm.
which is what you call
Which one?
The Britons, Wales.
Oh, that's west.
Okay, west. Sorry, I'm
That's okay.
directionally challenged.
That's all right. So much.
Was there Christianity present there?
We'll get into that next week. Hopefully we'll get into that next week. But because of the Germanic influence at this time, what you wind up seeing is that pockets of strongholds, if you will, Canterbury, London, York, they take shape. But because of the pushback from the Germanic tribes, Christianity is essentially driven west to Wales. But hopefully we'll touch on that next week. Okay? We good?